I'll add my thanks to all of those who have put this together and been so kind to us and cooked us such great food, and especially to Chango Fashu and Wendy for organizing this. I'm really happy to be here. So, let's see. I'm going to begin by thinking about two works of art featuring mirrors. And the first one is one entitled, very accurately, Portrait of a Young Man, William Tyler, Looking in a Mirror, by a guy named Thomas Worledge. He's an 18th century painter and etcher. And you can see that this etching is exactly what it promises. You've got a guy looking in the mirror, and he's got kind of a puffy visage and buoyantly coiffed hair. And this makes a kind of apt metaphor or emblem of the European Enlightenment, whose philosophers promised to develop methods that would hold man and nature up to a mirror of empirical investigation and rational analysis, rendering clear and distinct representations of them. Another quite different mirror-themed work is a series by the contemporary artist Yayoi Kusama, called Infinity Mirror Rooms. And in these, the viewer stands in a room whose walls are mirrors reflecting uncountable numbers of lights and images, and including often multiple images of the viewer herself. And so if Woolridge's image was compelling in the 18th century for its resonance with the Enlightenment ideal of the mirror of nature, we could see Kusama's image as possibly more resonant with our age, and its fragmentation, its consciousness of the vastness of the cosmos, its hope for some significance, some reflection of ourselves in this vastness. We might consider the two images to represent two archetypal ways of considering, or perhaps experiencing, oneself in the world. One represents a coherent sense of selfhood, distinct from the world and clear to itself, and this still echoes in our time and calls for authenticity, for self-realization, individualism, identity, thinking for oneself. And the other represents a contemporary sense of multiple, displaced, disembedded, vertiginous subjectivity, more difficult to pin down, more disorienting and perhaps frightening, but also potentially expansive and ecstatic. And the only images I have here really are just a few more of these, so somebody nudge me if I forget to show those as we go along. So these images illustrate competing versions of modern subjectivity. Although the infinity mirror model is more recent, the hand mirror model is by no means a relic of the past. We might instead see the contemporary era as characterized by a tension between the two. Now, what I'd like to think about today is how particular elements of Buddhism have been incorporated into the modern Western, although now not just Western, globalized life. Specifically, how these elements have been called forth to address some of the personal, social, and ecological problems of the day. More specifically, I want to think about how these elements have been magnetically drawn into the sphere of modernity by features of modern subjectivity that I've mentioned. The way we feel our lived experience in relation to others and in relation to the larger world. Now, we're often encouraged to think of solutions to especially ecological problems, but even social and personal problems as kind of mechanical problems. How can we keep the carbon in the atmosphere at a certain level? How can we ramp up solar production? How can we decrease anxiety with better medication? All these things are practical and sometimes technical problems, but they occur against a backdrop of, at least to a certain extent, a background of modern, the kind of underlying architecture of modern subjectivity that influences all of this. And so if these problems have emerged in part, as I think they have, from a historically and culturally constituted way of experiencing selfhood and the relationship between the self and the world, then reimagining that relationship might be a part of the solution. So what is the picture of the self and the self-world relationship I'm talking about, and what elements of Buddhism am I thinking about that might be helpful to address them? Well, I think particular elements of modern secularity have served as magnets that have drawn forth and transformed particular elements of Buddhism, especially the doctrine of non-self, anatman, dependent origination, and certain practices of meditation. And these elements, I suggest, have been transformed and are being transformed and embodied by modern people in ways that both attempt to embrace and also ameliorate certain aspects of modern subjectivity and its anxieties. More specifically, they attempt to negotiate this tension between the two modes of subjectivity illustrated by our images. One, this singular, independent, autonomous sense, and then also a sense of fragmentation of the self into multiple identities. So this reimagining has opened up, the reimagining of these Buddhist ideas has opened up new possibilities for traditional Buddhist ideas as they meet unprecedented circumstances and challenges of the modern world. So I'll address just a few elements of sort of this inherited singular notion of the Western idea of self, the modern Western idea of self, first. And it will be very brief and thumbnail sketchish. The Age of Enlightenment promised a sort of narrative clarity about the self. Descartes claimed to isolate the self, the soul definitively. I am nothing but a thinking thing. At its best, the soul or self had clear and distinct ideas, and the Enlightenment project entailed attempts to systematically account for the faculties of mind and body, nail them down, establish them once and for all, just what the soul and its faculties were and what its place was in the universe. The Enlightenment thinkers proposed that rationality was the essence of the self, and that through stepping away from the passions and relying solely on reason, one could make moral choices and live a good life. Romanticism countered this notion by insisting on the centrality of emotion, of passion, of deep interiority, of getting in touch with nature and the divine through interior exploration. And although they seem opposed, these two versions of selfhood were complementary in that they shared the notion of the autonomous individual whose judgment could and should transcend social convention and conditioning and be the sole author of itself. Charles Taylor, a contemporary philosopher, argues that a distinctive characteristic of this newly constituted self is that it is buffered. He calls it buffered rather than porous. That is, the modern West inaugurated a firmer boundary between self and objects than had existed in the pre-modern, as he puts it, enchanted world. In the enchanted world, he claims, this boundary was porous, and people experienced themselves as more vulnerable to the direct influences of external things. Gods, spirits, demons, the material world. Objects were charged with inherent meaning. Black bile is an example he uses. It's not just the physical cause of melancholy as a mental state in the medieval conception, but it was melancholy. Sand from a sacred place was thought to have inherent beneficial healing effects. These are not just a matter of beliefs, but a deep-rooted way of experiencing and interpreting oneself in the world. And this contrasts to the experience of the buffered or bounded self, in which the mind is inside completely, more distinct from the outside world. For buffered selves, the mind is the locus of all meaning, and the natural world, with no inherent meaning or value, became mere material and began to be seen primarily in an instrumental sense. So in a sense, this could be seen as a kind of exacerbation or exaggeration of what David was talking about by this kind of lack that may be just our kind of fundamental inheritance as human beings. So, if it's true then that a novel sense of configuring the relationship of subject and object gradually emerged in this period, not just on a theoretical, but on a phenomenological level, that is the way we experience ourselves, we might characterize late modernity, that is the latter half of the 20th century, as a period in which the sense of the autonomous buffered self begins to fray at the edges. Countless examples from philosophy, art, literature, sociology, psychology points to this, but I'll just offer a couple of illustrations, mainly from social theory and psychology. So the social theorist Anthony Giddens marks late or high modernity as a period of increased disembeddedness from traditional social orders, in which people's roles are more rigidly defined. Rather than being embedded in a family, a community, a social order, and a cosmos that gives de facto meaning to people's lives, people in the conditions of late modernity are increasingly thrown back upon themselves to continuously figure out and construct who they are. The self becomes what he calls a reflexive project. I'll quote from him. Transitions in individuals' lives have always demanded psychic reorganization, something which was often ritualized in traditional cultures in the shape of rites of passage. But in such cultures where things stayed more or less the same from generation to generation on the level of collectivity, the changed identity was clearly staked out, as when an individual moved from adolescence to adulthood. In the settings of modernity, by contrast, the altered self has to be explored and constructed as a part of a reflexive process of connecting personal and social change. Such conditions, Giddens argues, creates an increased uncertainty and doubt, as well as a sense of the fragility of one's own self-narrative. A self-identity has to be created and more or less continually reordered against the background of shifting experiences of day-to-day life and fragmenting tendencies of modern institutions. In pre-modern times, Giddens argues, people's identities were to a great extent shaped by gender, family, clan, lineage, and so on. Today, some of those factors may be still important in some places, but people increasingly must actively construct their identities through lifestyles, consumer choices, interaction with many abstract systems, such as the educational system, healthcare system, and the ubiquitous system of economic global capitalism. So one must continually construct and revise one's identity in multiple contexts, repeatedly adapting and creating a coherent life story that appears to maintain itself throughout time. According to Giddens, the splintering of the self and the energy-consuming struggle to maintain a sense of narrative coherence can lead to a disorienting sense of fragmentation, uncertainty, doubt, and the looming threat of personal meaninglessness. Zygmunt Bauman extends some of Giddens' insights on the malleability of the self and characterizes the contemporary period as one of liquid life, in which conditions change at such a rapid rate that predicting the future on the basis of the past becomes increasingly difficult and therefore anxiety-producing. He highlights the differential effects this situation has on people in different socioeconomic strata. Quote, "At the top of the social hierarchy, the problem is to choose the best pattern from the many currently on offer, to assemble the separately sold parts of the kit, and to fasten them together neither too lightly, lest the unsightly, outdated, and aged bits that are meant to be hidden underneath show through at the seams, nor too tightly, lest the patchwork resists being dismantled at a short notice when time for dismantling comes, as it surely will. At the bottom of the socioeconomic hierarchy, the problem is to cling fast to the sole identity available and to hold its bits and parts together while fighting back the erosive forces and disruptive pressures, repairing the constantly crumbling walls and digging the trenches deeper. So the self in this situation comes to feel itself as tenuous, fleeting, unstable, and thus continually in need of scrutiny and reform, while the external world is reduced to having primarily instrumental value. The construction of identity through career and consumer choices remains a privilege for those who can afford it, while the less privileged remain stuck in assigned, imposed, overdetermined identity that they're kind of stuck with. Psychologist Kenneth Gergen adds to this picture. I should switch the picture now. Whoops. I'm sorry, I hit the wrong button. Well, somebody will rescue me. Thank you. I use Macs, so sometimes I just don't know what I'm hitting.
So the next one,
yeah.
This is first. Done? This one. Right?
Yes. Yeah, maybe go back one.
Yeah, back one.
Yeah, good. Yeah, thank you. Psychologist Kenneth Gergen adds to this picture the ways that what he calls the technologies of social saturation, primarily media technologies, have contributed to this sense of self-fragmentation. Quote, emerging technologies saturate us with the voices of humankind, both harmonious and alien. As we absorb their various rhymes and reasons, they become part of us, and we of them. Social saturation furnishes us with a multiplicity of incoherent and unrelated languages of the self. For everything we know to be true about ourselves, other voices within respond with doubt and derision. This fragmentation of self-conceptions corresponds to the multiplicity of incoherent and disconnected relationships. These relationships pull us in myriad directions, inviting us to play such a variety of roles that the very concept of an authentic self with noble characteristics recedes from view. The fully saturated self becomes no self at all. So the saturated self, in his language, confronts these countless others, physical, fictional, virtual, and is called upon to respond to each, creating a sense of subjectivity characterized by, quote, a plurality of voices all vying for the right to reality. In this world, we no longer experience a secure sense of self, and doubt is increasingly placed on the very assumption of a bounded identity with palpable attributes. And Gergen dubs the infusion of partial identities through social saturation the populated self, a cacophony of images and voices representing disparate possibilities of selfhood that are constantly displaced by others. There is, therefore, a tension at work in late modern secular subjectivity, especially in the West. The modern construction of the self-sufficient, self-responsible, free agent, separate from the objective world, isolated and buffered, a lingering centripetal force of Enlightenment individualism, exists in tension with a centrifugal force of internal fragmentation, media saturation, rootlessness, and disembeddedness. The late modern subject, with the Enlightenment inheritance still part of the background understanding of individualistic personhood, is disturbed when that understanding is shattered daily by the forces of fragmentation. The man, looking at his singular reflection of the mirror, begins to see his image distort, double, triple, and explode into an infinity of images, some of himself, some of others, all scattering into a dizzying array of lights, expanding into infinity. How is it then that various strands of Buddhist thought and practice weave their way into this picture and might create a further chapter in this story? How are certain elements of Buddhism envisioned as either accommodating this sense of subjectivity or offering ameliorative, transformational possibilities for its ills? And how have these social conditions, along with others, created a space for certain Buddhist ideas and practices and have drawn them forth out of their home contexts to new habitations in late modern secularity? Well, the most obvious place to begin is with the Buddhist insistence on the absence of an independent, fixed, enduring, unchanging self, the Atman. So given the received notions of Western selfhood rooted in the Enlightenment and Romanticism, the prospects for this kind of doctrine would seem dim. But the idea of non-self functions in a particular way when drawn into the orbit of late modern subjectivity and its chaotic liquidity, media saturation, instability, disembeddedness, and fragmentation, not to mention the nostalgia for the stable, self-responsible agent of the Enlightenment. If Giddens and Bauman are right that many people in late modernity are disembedded from the social forces that provided a ready-made identity, and that instead we must now constantly ask, who am I? That identity is not given and so requires a constant, continuing task of constructing a stable narrative self, then certain interpretations of anatman become a compelling way of navigating this reality. If we have never had a coherent, stable, permanent self to begin with, then attempting to construct one is not only unnecessary, but futile. Better to recognize the fluid, malleable nature of consciousness, be aware of how various selves arise and fall depending on diverse causes and conditions, and learn to skillfully guide the process. This approach might serve to mitigate the anxiety of trying to anchor a stable sense of self amidst the whirlwind of ever-changing conditions of the late modern period. If the bad news of the modern autonomous if the bad news for the modern autonomous self is that it was a fiction to begin with, something that Western philosophy, psychology, neuroscience, and social science increasingly agree upon, the good news is that a rich, meaningful, and ethical life is available in its absence. If the fragmenting forces of late modernity have shattered the illusion of a fixed self, anatman provides a way of rethinking subjectivity in its absence. The doctrine of anatman claims that in the face of the constant flux of plural selves vying for the right to reality, as Gurdon puts it, that none actually has such a right. In a time of the multiplication of self-images and the frantic attempts to ground one of them in reality, reconfiguring subjectivity as non-self admits that such grounding will never happen, and moreover, that abandoning the attempt is part of a solution to the problem. And yet there is the possibility of agency and intention outside the confines of the isolated, autonomous self. Anatman introduces a way to imagine navigating the tensions between, on the one hand, the Cartesian notion of the bounded self, and on the other, the lived experience of fragmentation, saturation, and the permeability of the self. The autonomous self, it suggests, is a fiction. We are a combination of various processes coming together under the influence of past actions that color, constitute, and characterize the present. Yet we have agency in each moment for further directing this complex process, our own stream of consciousness, in more wise and compassionate directions. So reimagining subjectivity in this way is intimately intertwined with various adaptations of Buddhist meditative practices. if the splintering of subjectivity into multiple selves, commitments, projects, constitutes a uniquely modern anxiety, what new uses and transformations of mindfulness emerge in the space created by these conditions? First, we can see that mindfulness as the detached observation of these selves and their activities, which may desubstantialize them, decrease anxiety, and lessen the feeling of being trapped by them or overwhelmed by their mercurial flux, allowing room for critical reflection on the process. Rather than fleeing the modern burden of hyperreflexivity that Giddens outlines, meditative practices plunge the practitioner into the process in order to observe and reconfigure it. Mindfulness promises to harness the fragmented sense of self, cull it into a malleable, intention-directed stream of consciousness, and conjure a state of steadiness, even resoluteness, out of the infinitely plural phenomenological continuum. Given this, though, meditative practices might gravitate towards either of two poles. They might be used to shore up the buffered self and to reassert the lost sense of autonomous selfhood. Popular culture in the US and Europe, and increasingly around the world, tells us that we indeed have a self that we need to discover, and to discover it we need to look within. When we discover who we are, we must be true to that self, casting off socially conditioned influences to emerge as a truly free, autonomous, self-contained being. Some Buddhist-derived approaches to mindfulness implicitly take this approach, using contemplative methods originally designed to undermine the perception of a fixed, permanent self, to reinforce the individualism so deeply rooted in Western culture. They attempt to strike back against fragmentation by using meditation to reaffirm the integrated singular individual, the man in the mirror. In this sense, meditation, mindfulness, self-monitoring, self-observation have the potential to exacerbate the sense of individual isolation, separation from the world, even narcissism. These interpretations of mindfulness tend to be either purely introspective or instrumental, offering either private psychological comfort or increasing one's effectiveness at doing whatever we happen to be doing anyway. This can simply reinforce a sense of isolated individuality and opens the door to instrumentalized, decontextualized, commercialized, and corporatized applications of mindfulness. But the other pole of interpretation retains something more substantive from the Buddhist tradition and uses contemplative methods to deconstruct the singular identity, to recognize the radical impermanence and multiplicity of conscious experience, and to open up the buffered self, not necessarily to the spirits and demons of old, but to a new sense of connectionness and interwovenness with the world. This approach might mitigate the forces of fragmentation, not by retreating to a doubly bounded and isolated subjectivity, but by admitting the open, fluid, multiple nature of human consciousness and its intimate relations with other individuals, to community, to the physical objects in our lives, and to the natural and built worlds we inhabit. There is therefore a tension between two poles of interpretation of modern secular mindfulness practices. At one pole is mindfulness as a private matter, a matter of personal experience, psychological health, or instrumental efficiency. The other is mindfulness as an awakening to a more urgent sense of connectedness with others, which may foster particular ethical sensibilities. I'm skipping ahead just a little bit here in the interest of time. These reimaginings of subjectivity through the idea of non-self, as well as through contemporary interpretations of meditation I've mentioned, are both intimately related to modern articulations of the classical Buddhist doctrine of dependent arising. The resurgence of and rethinking about this ancient doctrine is perhaps inevitable in today's world, in which interconnectivity is the undeniable blessing and curse of the age. Contemporary interconnectedness allows the grandmother in Taiwan to talk in real time to her grandson in Evansville, Illinois, and the carpet buyer in Los Angeles to put money in the pocket of a sweatshop owner in Pakistan. It allows feminism, white nationalism, lithium batteries, and CO2 to pervade the globe with ease and speed unimaginable even a generation ago. Modern notions of interdependence extend to the cosmic realm as humanity gets used to the recently discovered fact of the near unimaginable vastness of the universe. It's no wonder that people stand in line at Kusama's infinity mirror rooms in order to feel the expansive sense of themselves and the world in countless reflected images, mingling and trailing off into endlessness. That's my cue to show a different one. Various commentators have noticed the affinity of these infinity mirror rooms with Buddhist ideas. Thich Nhat Hanh's formulation of interbeing, for instance, his descriptions of the cloud and the paper, a lot of us are probably familiar with this. The rain produces the cloud, which produces a tree, which provides materials for the paper. The mutual dependence of roses and garbage and so on provide mundane examples of how things exist in a vast process of mutually interdependent events. We too are a part of this process of the cosmos producing innumerable forms in a vast web of interconnected life. I am not this limited form, but the entire process in this view, the entire ocean, and not merely this one temporary wave. Such images take the mundane stuff of life and weave it together in ways that strive at once to gently obliterate the fixed independent self and of the Enlightenment, and to ease the frenetic fragmentation of the saturated self through mindfulness. Or perhaps ease into that fragmentation and re-envision it as communion with all things. Interbeing takes the raw ingredients of secular cosmology and infuses them with wonder by imagining the reopening of the isolated self into the cosmos, the reintegration into the alienated world, and expansion of the I into all things. Modern interpretations of interdependence like this negotiate ways in which the fraying of the self-contained individual, with its scattering across so many spheres of activity, obligation, and meaning, can be called to order as a beautiful, expansive interwovenness with the cosmos. Rather than experiencing the world as a network of hostile forces aligned against an individual self, on the one hand, or as an overwhelming array of ever-splintering selves, on the other, one is invited to imagine all things as contiguous with the self. Such a view offers a kind of re-enchanted cosmology that affirms the truths of scientific naturalism, with its webs of life and complex systems, giving them a sense of mystery and wholeness. They don't just state facts about people and their relationships to the cosmos, they help cultivate sensibilities, encourage a way of experiencing oneself as a part of an infinite whole, and foster a feeling of attunement with that whole. If modern articulations of interdependence are enchantments of the secular interdependence, they are also secularizations of earlier Buddhist models. In fact, Kusamas are not the first infinity mirrors to emerge from Asia. In the 2nd century Buddhist text, the Gandavyuha Sutra, for example, part of the Avatamsaka Sutra, it's just an orgy of visionary imagery designed to disrupt the ordinary sense of self, space, and time through the infinite multiplication of images. In its climax, the main character, a pilgrim named Sudana, encounters a great enlightened being, Samantabhadra. Rather than having a conversation, Sudana gazes at him and sees that there are universes as infinite as the sands of the Ganges in each of the pores of his skin. In each universe, Sudana sees himself performing a multitude of bodhisattva activities. Later in 6th and 7th century China, the Huayan Buddhist philosopher Fazang attempted to boil down the narrative to a single image. Reality is like a candle in a room with opposite-facing mirrors. Everything reflects and interpenetrates everything else while still remaining distinct. Another image used in Huayan Buddhism, which has become popular in recent ecological discussions, Indra's net. A net expanding out infinitely with a multifaceted reflecting jewel at each juncture. Each jewel in the net reflects all of the other jewels, while the single jewel is also reflected in all the other jewels. So how is it that such images are drawn into the sensibilities of modern subjectivity and transformed by its hopes, fears, and anxieties? Like modern mindfulness, the infinity mirror model of the self has two possible poles of interpretation. First is an aestheticized version of interdependence, focusing on wonder and comfort, blunting the soft edges of gritty physicality, shedding a soft focus light on the harsh realities of death, illness, aging, and vulnerability to the capriciousness of the world. In this sense, it may be comforting, but potentially anesthetizing of the reality that Buddhism itself has insisted we should look squarely at. The other pole, however, holds additional possibilities. If the valorization of wonder pushes human agency in the direction of passivity, other interpretations insist on ethical, social, and political implications. They urge action. It's no wonder that Indra's net has become a recurring image in ecological and social thought, where it's a potent symbol for the densely interconnected biosphere or the fraying social fabric, both under threat. Shake one part of the net and reverberations are projected throughout its entirety, like coal smoke from China reaching Alaska or ethnic nationalism in the United States resonating with similar movements throughout Europe and spreading like wildfire across the internet. Here, the vision of the entwinement of the self and world tends not, or at least not only, toward passive wonderment, but also towards a heightened sense of ethical, social, and political responsibility. Infinite interconnectedness as an ethical imperative entails a recognition that all actions reverberate into the wider world. It opens up attention to what some have called systemic suffering, perpetuated by webs of interactions inherent in the globalized economic and political spheres. It encourages re-envisionings of right livelihood to include, for example, consumer choices of the wealthy and their effects on the lives of the poor and the disenfranchised. Some contemporary Buddhist authors encourage a sense of empathy that fosters imagining oneself as the other, as all others, as everything, and taking responsibility for the world as one would take responsibility for a part of one's own body. If I'm right that there are tensions, creative and conflictual, between these different approaches to non-self, meditation, and interdependence, then underlying these tensions is perhaps the fundamental tension between versions of Buddhism as primarily a private matter, a matter of personal experience and psychological health, and Buddhism as more active and engaged in the monumental social, political, and ecological problems of the present age. This is not a stark binary choice, and I think there is a spectrum of possibilities in between. Someone might, for example, use mindfulness for reducing stress, but also be a very avid political activist. In short, Buddhist thought has many potential ways of parlaying the anxieties of the current era into meaningful and effective action. This becomes clear if we add to the ingredients I've mentioned above the injunction, found especially in Mahayana sutras and commentaries, that the bodhisattva must act with endless ingenuity for the benefit of all beings. It's significant that in Suddhana's grand vision in the Avatamsaka Sutra of himself in infinite worlds within the pores of the Buddha's skin, it's significant that in contemplating that vision, he doesn't see himself just sitting there. He's acting. He's acting in each one of those mirrors for the benefit of all beings. Surely no one could conceive of such actions today without including those that mitigate the unfolding ecological catastrophe that is upon us, or relieving the tremendous social injustices wrought by ruthless forms of capitalism, authoritarianism, and oppression based on race, gender, and sexuality. The reconfiguration of the doctrines of Anatman and interdependence, along with meditative practices, exemplifies Buddhism's potential to contribute to a new sense of subjectivity that not only invokes fractal order out of fragmented chaos, but also affirms action and responsibility in the face of systemic suffering and injustice. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. McMahan. In our everyday lives, it's really a word for hope, or even in this century, there's so many rules or person's place. So it just really shows how we're connected to everyone around us and connected to our world. 不管是在家里面，还是在工作，还是在这个道场，我每个都在不同的角色。我这也是表示说，我是跟我所有接触的人都是紧密相关、紧密相连的。Thank you very much. Now we open up the floors for audience to the audience for questions. 如果你有任何问题、意见的话，现在都可以提出。
Just following, I love the way you put things, and one of the phrases that struck me is that from fragmented to fractal-like. And, these evocative images are these museum goers?
Yes.
Seeing themselves?
Yeah.
So the fragmented is kind of connected with a universal web. But then how do we go from fragmented solipsism to fractal-like, in some ways, ordered relations with the many beings and the people?
Right.
What's the dynamic in between cosmos and fragments?
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't think there's one answer. I mean, I think it really involves sort of a rebuilding of community, because a lot of especially the media saturation seems to be this kind of odd dynamic where you're in communication and connection with a lot of different people, but you're not really maybe in communion with them. And I think the way the kind of reimaginings of interdependence help here is that that it really does help to just reframe things. If all the things out there that, the multiplicity is just this overwhelming thing that is coming at you all the time, then it sort of reinforces this sense of me against the world. But if there's a kind of more of an opening, then it's a way of interpreting things as a sense of communion. And if that can be bridged with actual community building things, then I think that can be a thing. But I didn't really get into the how do we do this? How do we get the fractal from the fragmented? And I think it's a complex, long process of rebuilding something that we've kind of lost, that we're in the process of losing.
enjoyed your presentation. I have, I guess, two short questions. Maybe they are not short, or maybe they're connected. So one is I really appreciate your analysis of the kind of re-enchanted naturalism, because it helps to show how some of the interconnectedness with nature talk, it dovetails with the secular pleasure in appreciating nature that we get in sort of nature shows and looking at the natural world in addition to the more sort of romantic vision of sort of taking a hike through around Walden Pond. Those things are connected in some way in the sort of modern re-enchanted naturalism that they're talking about, which I think is really interesting. So maybe that's just an observation, but I wonder if is that observation something you're drawing from another thinker? Because I think it's a really nice observation. So that was the first question. The other, well, maybe that's all I need to do. I'll answer the question.
No, I'm not really drawing from anybody in particular, but I've been thinking a little bit about the issue of imagination and how maybe within a Buddhist framework it might be interesting to re-examine the concept of imagination, because I think in some of the received ways that we've learned to think about Buddhism, we want to have this kind of unmediated encounter with reality, and imagination is the enemy of that. But I think if you read some of these very playfully evocative, wild Mahayana sutras with all their imagery and everything, you get another sort of possible way of thinking about that, which is that no matter what, we're always imagining our way into reality. Even if it's the truth that we're imagining, we have to use our imaginations to conceive of, what they tell us about quantum physics. And so a lot of just seemingly true things we have to encounter through an extension of our imagination. So the fact that the universe is huge and vast doesn't necessarily mean that it's horrible, it's cold, it's the vacuum of space, and therefore life is meaningless, and I'm becoming a French existentialist. So it can mean, wow, there's this expansive, infinite hugeness, and I'm a part of it. And so, I want to sort of re-embrace in a way this imaginative, interpretive function, and sort of recast that as not necessarily in opposition to a kind of bald encounter with reality that Buddhists often talk about.
So you've reminded me of the second question, which was, what's your relationship to the Gandavyuha and other symbols that you're evoking here as clearly traditional Buddhist symbols that are being re-invoked in this contemporary world? How much do you see that as we now have insight into something that was being expressed in those texts that maybe when we were too caught up in a modernist understanding of the self or something, we didn't quite see the imagination that was present there?
Yeah, I think that's a good way to put it. Some of my work has involved the various kinds of filters through which Buddhism has come down to us in the modern age, and there's been a lot that's left out, and there's a lot that we've inevitably, selectively incorporated. And the more visionary stuff has often been kind of left behind. But I think there are sort of fun, interesting ways to rethink it in the modern world. And the encounter with vastness is something that you really don't find in other forms of ancient literature. It's interesting, like the ancient Greeks lived in a pretty small world, But the ancient Indians is just like huge lengths of time and big lengths of space. They kind of invented that idea. So, going back to them and say, wow, how do you live in a universe like that? Might be an interesting question.
Thank you. One of my good friends who's both a Dharma teacher and a psychotherapist says that Buddhists tend to be conflict avoidant. And I tend to think a lot about this in terms of social engagement and how the kind of people who are attracted to something like Buddhist meditation, it may not only be the case that there's something in the way that path is conceived of, but also maybe something in our personalities that don't encourage that.
Yeah.
In a way, I wanted to follow up with your answer to, I think, the first question. Is there something about the kinds of practices that we have accepted as normative, so very individualistic? I'm thinking of Milarepa, right? And it's interesting, he's the guy who is, according to the Tibetan tradition, he sort of became Buddha, attained Buddhahood in one lifetime. But he was living in the cave by himself all that time, eating nettles, etc. And I'm wondering if somehow we're continuing with an understanding of practices that reinforce the individualism and to a large extent the sense of separation, as opposed to practices that acknowledge our intersubjective construction. And I'm wondering if somehow one of the things that we need to, which will help us build Sangha, is somehow more interactive processes. I mean, to some degree, it seems to me that the kind of insights that we can get sitting on a cushion are very nice, but the deeper challenge, certainly in my life, is sort of getting up from the cushion and actually integrating those into how I relate to other people. That's much harder.
Yeah.
And I just wonder if we've been if this is one of the growing edges of Buddhism that is going to be important for engagement, but just in general, in acknowledging something about the way we develop, and that it's not just individualized insight.
Yeah. Yeah, I think you're right. And I do think that the path whereby meditation has entered the modern world, especially the modern West, is through our emphasis on individualism. Here's something you can do. You can sit down and you can get an individual insight in your private mind, and that'll be great for you. And so, and I think there are traditions that sort of do enforce that in some of the Buddhist traditions, but it doesn't have to be limited to that. I mean, certainly there is a very vibrant social aspect to Buddhism and has been the whole time. So, yeah, it may be up to modern people to sort of invent those practices. And I know some people who kind of are. I know one guy who has some kind of interactive vipassana practice.
Insight dialogue.
Yes, insight dialogue. And so, these are some ways that we might take some of the more individualist interpretations of meditation and open them up a little bit. So.
Thank you, David. I love the talk. And when you talked about this, the issue of enchantment really reminded me of Dave Max Weber's work. You probably drew on that. And it reminded me of his argument of what's happening in modernity, the shift towards this form of rationality, of the means to an end rationality, which you actually describe it in the secular mindfulness movement, that make the use of meditation to achieve personal goals of more calmness, happiness, psychological well-being, which missed the larger picture of the practice. And it reminded me of the importance of the other kind of rationality that Weber argued that we're shifting away from in modernity, which is really constructive rationality that recognizes the importance of value. And you argue that being to returning to the importance of integrating the ethical dimension of our practice. When we see that, then then it becomes very obvious that the practice is not just for ourselves, for our own well-being, but it is to fulfill responsibility we have as a member of this universe,
Yeah.
of our world.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I think that's an important conversation that's starting to happen in the worlds of mindfulness, that people are saying, okay, are these just individual isolated practices that anybody can do and then apply to whatever, or does there have to be some kind of ethical component? I mean, they were never presented just by themselves in any kind of traditional Buddhist context. And, you know, I wouldn't even say, I'm not against Buddhist-derived mindfulness practices being taught outside of Buddhism. I think that's they can be very helpful. But I would like to see people develop more of a kind of robust, kind of ethical cultivation around them, even if it's in a completely secular setting. Mindfulness for better, you know, corporate raiding and you know, sniper activity is not the best thing.